Hi, welcome to another edition of Shakespeare TV. We've had a lot of questions relating to pellet waggler fishing on commercials, and you join us here today at Packington Somers. It's a fantastic commercial situated between Coventry and Birmingham. So we're going to have a go at answering those questions and also give you some tips relating to this devastating method, the pellet waggler. Okay, well, the pellet waggler itself is a form of float fishing, evolved predominantly on commercial fisheries such as this, and as the name suggests, obviously revolves around fishing with pellets as bait. Now, pellets are such a devastating bait on commercials, predominantly because the fish are bred on them, they're grown on them, so it's a natural bait for the fish. So the waggler itself, the pellet waggler, is normally quite a thick float compared to what you'd use normally on a natural venue, thick in diameter, and it's also got a good capacity because basically you're going to be fishing the float past the pole line. If you were going to be fishing the pellet closer in, you'd be using a pole, but when you can't, if you may be limited by the length of the pole or you've got to get further out to fish to a far bank feature such as this island, that's where the pellet waggler becomes so devastating. Pellet waggler rods have evolved as the methods evolved. I mean, you could just use any old float rod like your standard 12 or 13 foot float rod, and that would be fine for most cases. But as the methods evolved, the rods have become more specialised. So I'm going to show you two different versions. The first one's a 12 foot agility pellet waggler. Now, a 12 foot rod is perfect when you're fishing at a fairly long distance, so let's say 30 to 40 metres out from the bank. That extra length just helps with the casting, and it also enables you to cast the heavier floats that are going to be needed to cast that distance. Most pellet waggler rods now are two-piece, as are most commercial rods, and that's a great advantage in terms of being able to leave the rod and reel with the rig assembled in a rod sleeve or in a hard case, so that the rod and the rig is ready to fish at the drop of a hat. I've also set up today an 11 foot pellet waggler. In this case, this is an Agility EXP, and when you don't need to cast the distance, so when you're talking perhaps between 10 and 30 metres, an 11 foot pellet waggler comes into its own. That's a bit different to a standard float rod, obviously, in that it's a shorter length, and this really helps with the repeated casting. The shorter length, the lighter rod, means that you don't suffer from fatigue with the constant casting, and also you don't need a long rod. You don't need that long rod to get you the distance. It also helps when you're playing the fish, because you'll find that the fish come up closer to the bank and you can net them far more efficiently. So if you're not fishing at a long distance, I'd recommend looking at an 11 foot rod such as this one. Moving on to the reels, I've actually set up two of the Agility reels, both in a 35 size, which absolutely match the rods perfectly, and you can notice that they're both a front and a rear drag design. And really, that's just down to personal preference. That's why we offer them in two different versions. Some people prefer a rear drag, some people prefer a front drag. A rear drag can be an advantage in that it's obviously easier to adjust, maybe if you're less experienced. The front drag scores over the rear drag in my opinion because of its compact nature, and also the fact that the drag with its front drag is more efficient and smooth. So that's just a bit of a difference on the two versions. The line I'm using is 4 pound Trilene XL. Now, 4 pound doesn't sound like a heavy line when you consider the weights that you can be catching on a pellet waggler, but unless I'm fishing for really big carp and catching big carp consistently, I find 4 pound line is more than adequate in terms of strength, and a good reliable reel line like this will also be robust, so it won't suffer from any breakages or wear during the session, and with it being that little bit thinner will enable you to cast the floats much smoother and more efficiently. Okay, so I've set up 3 different rigs with 3 different floats for fishing today, and I'm going to take you through each of those ones. First up is this Drennan Crystal loaded pellet waggler. Now, as I mentioned in the introduction, pellet wagglers are a pretty stumpy, short design to enable you to cast the distance and present the bait correctly. Obviously pellets are quite heavy, so they're different to normal baits like maggots and casters, and you need a different type of float. Now you'll notice that this float, in fact all the floats I'm using today, are loaded, and this really helps to make the rig very efficient, but also work very easily. As you can see, I've got the waggler attached to a waggler attachment here, which I can adjust very easily, so I can change the depth and move the float up and down without damaging the line. That's a key advantage over using bulk shots like AAAs or SSGs that will be required to cock a float with such a capacity. Now I like this crystal design because when you're fishing on a mixed venue such as this, where you might be catching big carp but also smaller carp, F1s, other fish like tench, it gives you the sensitivity to pick out bites from these shy biting fish. So this is perhaps erring towards the size of what you'd use in terms of a typical float with typical baits, but specifically developed for the pellet waggler. The next float I'm going to show you is this Garbolino design. Again, it's preloaded with this brass weight, and in this case it's adjustable, so you can remove and add washers to adjust the buoyancy of the float. Now these floats cast very accurately and they cast great distances, and they also have another key attribute in that when they land with a splash, and that's something that we need to think about when we're thinking about pellet waggler fishing. As we look at it in more detail, you'll see that that's a very important factor. So again, it's a good buoyant float that's going to get the pellet to where I want. And really all these pellet wagglers are so simple in terms of the rig. I don't have any shot on the line at all. I've just got a hook length with the hook, and then I've got that waggler attachment, so I can change the waggler and I can move the float to adjust the depth. The final rig I'm looking at is an interesting one that John Birchall, the fishery manager, has lent me. And this is really taking this idea of the float splashing into the water to another level. As you can see, the design of this float, it almost looks like a marker float or something that you'd use for pike fishing. But basically it's loaded again, so I can get the distance very easily, but the impact of the float creates a splash that actually mimics the splash of the pellets as they're hitting the water, so the fish actually become conditioned to come towards that splash. And obviously you've got the bait situated below the float, so that just enhances the effectiveness of the rig, and in many cases will actually create a self-hooking rig. So this additional weight in the capacity of the float will help to hook the fish, so you don't actually really need to strike in the normal way when you're float fishing. So that's quite a specialised rig, but the one can be absolutely devastating when you're fishing the pellet waggler. Okay, so let's look at the hook lengths. Now, as you can see, I've spent some time to pre-tie some hook lengths, basically to obviously be more efficient in a match situation, but also it helps me to be able to present the bait or different baits in different ways. When you're pellet fishing, you're going to have to hair rig the pellet, and the easiest way to do that is to use some bait bands that go onto the hair. So what actually happens is that elastic band is stretched around the pellet with this neat little device here, so that I can actually trap the pellet on the band very quickly and efficiently, and I've got a fantastic hair rig. So that's probably my favourite way of doing it because it's so quick and easy. You could of course drill the pellets, or you could use soft pellets, but that's a great way of rigging up the actual pellet on the hair rig. I also like to have a few hook links ready to go with bait stops, with the bayonet style bait stop, so that I can change bait such as sweet corn or luncheon meat, so I can use that in a very efficient way as well. And finally, I've got some hook lengths tied up with bayonets, so that I can bayonet a little mini boilie on, and again, for a change bait, it's nice to try that, because on certain days it really can work. So I've got 3 different ways of actually presenting the bait. The hooks I'm using today are Camazan B911 in size 14 and 16. These are a very strong hook, obviously eyed so that I can create the hair rig, and they're barbless, which obviously is required on nearly all commercial fisheries nowadays. This hook gives me a great compromise between strength and sharpness. So again, on a mixed fishery where I'm going to get a variety of fish, that's my first hook choice. The actual hook length material is made up of Berkeley XWR, and I'm using 0.16mm on the size 16 hook and 0.18mm on the size 14 hook. So it's all good, strong, reliable gear, and one that's going to stand up to the rigours of pellet waggler fishing. So there's obviously a huge variety of pellets available. When you're fishing the pellet waggler, you've got to consider that you've got to get the pellets out that you feed in to the area that you need to fish very efficiently. And that can help dictate the size of the pellet that you're going to use. Obviously a bigger pellet, such as an 8mm or a 10mm, is going to fire further than the smaller pellets. Another important consideration to think about is the type of fish that you're going to be fishing for in terms of the size. If you're going to be targeting bigger carp or trying to selectively target bigger carp, then the bigger pellets like the 8 and 10mm or even the 14mm would be what you're feeding and also putting on the hook. On venues like this where you've got a variety of different species, I quite like to feed a 6mm pellet and either fish a 6mm pellet on the hook, on the hair rather, or a bigger 8mm pellet to see if I can focus and target on some bigger fish. Another consideration to think about is the fishery rules. On some venues you have to use the pellets provided by the fishery, or you can use your own. And where I can, I like to use pellets that are actually flavoured. As you can see in this case, these ones are tiger nut, and I find them to be very, very successful. In many venues, halibut pellets, because of their high oil content, are actually banned. So you just need to check out what you can use at the various venues that you're fishing. I actually like to dampen my pellets when I'm fishing, just very, very lightly, and this does 2 things. It means that they just become a little bit softer, which I think the fish prefer, and also it means that when I'm using the pellet band, it actually embeds in that outer coating, so it just hides the band a little bit. Another advantage is that it actually seems to let them fire further. So for the same size, I can fire a pellet that's slightly dampened a little bit further and more accurately. So that's the reason why I do that. And I also like to experiment with adding some different dips to that water. So in this case, it's Irish cream. And I think that also gives me some confidence that I'm doing something different to the anglers around me. So I do like to consider using a dip with the pellets as well. And just finally, I know we're talking about the pellet waggler, but I do like to have a few change baits. I'll always have some corn with me, which I can hair rig, like I showed you. Some mini boilies, in this case squid and liver, 8mm, just to give me a change bait. Like I mentioned, it might just encourage a bonus fish, or it might be a better method on the day. It's always worth trying. And maybe because I'm a bit old school, but I always have a pint of maggots with me, and a bunch of maggots when you're fishing on the pellet waggler can be a great change bait as well. So that basically summarises the different baits that I use when I'm fishing the pellet waggler. As you're fishing for most part on the pellet waggler past the pole line, obviously you've got to use a catapult to get the feed out there. And I think this is a really key area that's worth mentioning. I've got a variety of different catapults that I use for different size pellets that I'm feeding. And it's worth mentioning that the different pouches, different lengths of elastic and strengths of elastic will be required for the different pellets and the different ranges that you're fishing. Today I'm using the Drennan Team England catapult. That's a great catapult. I'm regularly loose feeding the 6 and 8mm pellets, but only in 3 or 4s. So I don't need a big capacity, and I want to try and group the feed as tight as possible to where I'm fishing. I don't want to be spreading the bait all over the place. When I'm fishing longer ranges, I've got some other catapults that I use with stronger elastics, and again, by dictating the length of the elastic will help me to feed the pellets very accurately at the given range that I want to fish at. It's also worth having a few catapults with you and some spare elastic, because I've already broken, as you can see, 1 catapult. So it's worth bearing in mind that the constant feeding required for this method puts a terrible strain on your catapults. So the pellet waggler is a very active form of fishing. I'm going to be casting very, very regularly, and I'm going to be feeding also very regularly, maybe 2 or 3 times a cast. Initially, I'm going to start off by catapulting 3 or 4 8mm pellets, and I've selected an area around about 1 metre from the far bank. Obviously, the island and the far bank provides great cover for the fish, and I'm trying to draw them away from that and fish amongst the pellets, but also tight up against the island depending on how the fish are responding. Quite often I'll start off by loose feeding the pellets and then casting out on top of where I've fed. This helps me to be able to react to a bite immediately if I get one, rather than putting the rod down or looking away and feeding. Quite often with the pellet waggler, the bite can be almost instantaneous. As the float hits the water, the pellet hits the water, and the fish takes the bait. They get so conditioned to feeding up in the water on the pellets as they hit the water and fall down through the water column. So I don't try to move the float at all. I try to keep it where it's landed to maximise on that attraction of the float hitting the water. And if I get a bite and I miss it like that, I'm straight back in and just quickly check the bait and then repeat the process. So by catapulting 3 8mm pellets back out into the swim, closely followed by the float. Now I've got a general area that's established, and as I mentioned when I was talking about the catapults and the pellets, we want to try to keep that area as tight as possible, and that's difficult when the wind's gusting like on a day like today. But it's also worth bearing in mind that you can cast around that area. Sometimes the fish will back off the feed, and a cast to a different area in the swim will often produce a bite straight away. Now I have clipped up with the line on the spool to fix the distance that I'm casting, and if I don't have a bite, like in this case, I'll sometimes twitch it back over that feed area, and that sometimes can provoke a bite as well. There we go, that worked on that occasion. I don't think it's a big fish, probably an F1, but it just shows how important it is to fish tight to the cover and also to twitch the bait if you've not had a bite. So yeah, as we expected, it's a small F1. Great little fish, and here at Packington they really grow to some quite decent sizes, up to around about 4 pounds. So they're great weight builders. So again, just emphasising getting into a rhythm of feeding. Once I've caught a fish, I'll feed straight away. I've got to get another pellet mounted. But what we're trying to do is obviously attract the fish to the area where we're fishing, but also get them competing for the bait. So I don't want to be firing out mountains of bait. I just want to be feeding little and often, and hopefully getting a good rhythm of feeding, casting and hooking the fish. Something that I found a bit difficult to adapt to when I compare float fishing on a natural venue such as a river is that when you're fishing with a pellet waggler, you don't want to dot the float right down. Obviously, when you're fishing with maggots and lighter baits, you need to get the maximum sensitivity out of the float. But with the pellet, like I mentioned, some of the floats actually almost are self-hooking. So the weight of the float and the fact that it's not dotted down will actually help to enhance the self-hooking of the rig. I've also learned that I don't want to hit the little knocks and nudges on the float, which is what I'm tempted to do. It's better to leave the float for a more positive bite, because I think a lot of cases that's actual line bites of the fish hitting the main line or the hook length and giving you a false bite. In some cases the bites can be really positive and you can see the line just shoot away and the fish has hooked itself. There we go. I think this is another F1, but a bit bigger than the last one. There we go, that's a nice F1. And as I mentioned, great weight builders. So repeat the process, 3 or 4 pellets, and then get the float in amongst them as quickly as possible. As with all float fishing, it's important to consider that your depth that you're fishing. The maximum depth over by the islands is around about 2 foot, and you need to be fishing any depth between that and maybe as shallow as 10 inches or even 6 inches. So with these quick change adapters, it's really easy to adjust the depth, and that can make the difference between missing bites and hooking fish. So it's really important to experiment with changing the depth that you're fishing. This feels like a better carp, and you can see how progressive the action of the rod is, helping to absorb all the lunges of the fish and as it runs. I think it's a big tench. That's a nice way to end the session, with a decent tench. I've had around about 50 pound of F1s and 1 decent carp plus that tench. Just shows what a wonderful and effective method the pellet waggler is on commercials such as this. I hope that's helped you, and please feel free to send any emails and let me know if you've got any more questions relating to pellet waggler fishing. See you next time.